I'm speaking this evening with a panel actually up in the lobby upstairs in this wonderful building, beautiful building. It's really a lovely space, which I think is kind of evidence of cities taking their downtowns seriously, of redeveloping, of bringing in art, good design, and good food. And I am going to be talking about good food for everybody, because that's what I happen to believe in. That's what I've worked on my entire professional life, and it's what I write about. And I do have one of my books for sale, Food Rebels, Guerrilla Gardeners, and Smart Cookin' Mamas, for $15. And I think that, given the exchange rate with the US dollar, I think that's a good deal. I hope it is. If it's not, let me know. I'll charge more. The thing that strikes me, even as somebody who's been working in food systems for 40 years, and let me just be clear that by food systems I'm talking about, that sort of table, field to plate, seed to table, seed to compost bin and beyond. Everything, all that kind of web of interconnections that makes food available to us, that we participate in producing, sitting down at the table together, enjoying meal with friends and family, the connections to health, the connections to the environment, the connections to our economies. All of this is our food system. And as we know today, more than ever, at least since perhaps, that I can remember, and certainly since perhaps World War II, food is a really big deal, a bigger deal than I've ever seen before. And it became really apparent to me a couple of years ago how big a deal food was when I was talking with my 86-year-old mother who lives in Virginia. And my mother is not online. She doesn't tweet. She doesn't have a Facebook page. She sends me little handwritten notes on nice stationery. Everything's handwritten, and usually telling me what she's doing. I get these usually every other week, and they usually ends with something like, "Mark, why don't you write?" And but about a year ago, she started sending me news clippings from her own little newspaper with stories about community gardens opening up, or a farmer's market opening up, or a food workshop, or something happening, some cooking program. Every time I'd open up her nice little notes, a news clipping would fall out, and it would be something about food. And so I was talking to her on the phone one day. I said, "Mom, what's going on here? You're sending me all these news clippings." And she says, "Mark, for the first time in my life, I actually understand what it is you do for a living." As Kurt Vonnegut once said, take it from somebody who's been around about 1,000 years, food is pretty much the whole story all the time. Why? Why is it such a big deal now? Well, I think one piece of the good news is that it's kind of a good news, bad news story, I suppose, and why food is a big deal. The good news, I think, is that our palates maybe have become a bit more refined. I don't know if anyone's noticed that. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s, and my mother, bless her heart, was one who embraced every processed food product that was put on the market by the food industry. And that's what I was raised on. And every sort of experimental design of food, or something they called food, was placed in front of me. If I had a palate at all at that point, it was illiterate. It was highly uneducated. And it wasn't until perhaps college or after that I began to realize that there was this thing called good food, that food had taste. And I think all of us, in one way or another, have been discovering that over the last 20 years. There's a difference between a real tomato in your backyard and one that's bought off the shelf and shipped in from wherever. I think also good news, food has become sort of a marker of our improved quality of life in general. We don't suffer as much from food insecurity. Scarcity is something that has been more or less banished from our vocabulary when it comes to food. Restaurants, of course, are everywhere. Farmers markets seem to be everywhere. It seems to be kind of this whole sort of invention of what good living is about, what quality is about, and food is very much a part of that. But there's another side as well, as we know, that downside, you might say, that as many of us have improved our diets, as many of us who are enjoying food in different ways, in many diverse ways more than ever, and as many of us who are sort of see food as a big part of our quality of life, we know that we're getting fatter, we're getting sicker from what we eat, and that overweight and obesity are serious public health problems. They certainly are. I would say it's the biggest one in the United States. 65% of Americans are overweight or obese. The Center for Disease Control is estimating that up to 30% of Americans will be diabetic by the year 2050, unless we get our eating and our physical activity under control. And the leading cause of rejection now for military recruits in the U.S. Armed Forces is overweight and obesity. Now, I'm a great fan of world peace, but this is not the way to achieve it. Being too fat to fight is not what we want to do. So you can see that is, I know in Canada you're beginning to catch up to the United States. I'd urge you to slow down. This is not a competition, not a healthy competition. Try to look at your maintaining a healthy weight. We also know that there is, like never before, a connection between food and the environment, food and climate. Our food production methods, especially the intensive, more factory-style industrial forms of food production, have made a serious and severe contribution to global warming. We also know that many of our agricultural practices have polluted the environment, the water, groundwater, surface water. There is in fact a degradation and a loss of our natural resources absolutely necessary to food production. And it's not just pollution or toxic impacts, it's as much as often simply the loss of land to development. Good agricultural land, good soils, good ranch land being lost to non-agricultural, non-food producing purposes. Unless we manage that part of our lives well, we're going to find ourselves in very serious shape. I just came before 24 hours ago, I think, I can't even remember right now, I was in South Korea. That's where I was there for about a week doing some speaking and consulting. And believe me, the South Koreans take food real seriously. Now, I ate way too much kimchi. I think I had my quota of kimchi for the decade. But I was astounded by how well they take care of the land that they have available for food production. In areas where every square inch of land that could be and was suitable in any way at all for food production, anything that was open, not being used, was planted in gardens. I've never seen so many gardens. I've never seen such a intensive use of land for rice and for vegetable production on small, very, very small scale. And they are absolutely taking food security seriously there. The other important aspect of food and why it's a big deal is the relationship to our economy. In some places, actually most places, food is either the second or third largest sector of our economy. If you take everything from field to plate, if you take all the jobs from farm workers to bus boys and bus girls, a lot of jobs, a lot of money are in our food economy. We have not really paid attention to that. We've kind of taken it for granted. And of course, we know food security and insecurity are big deals all over the world. Not as much in North America, but in the United States, 15% of our population is considered food insecure or hungry. Our U.S. Department of Agriculture sort of likes to play around with the definitions of those areas, mainly usually to accommodate varying political concerns. So instead of having hunger, we now have a very low food security. That's the new definition, but 15% more or less of our population fits into that category. But we also know that worldwide it's a bigger deal. We know that in places like Egypt or Tunisia, People spend up to 40% of their income annually on food. It's part of the reason that when food prices go up, people get into the streets, they riot. This contributes to political instability, and is with some very serious consequences, as we have seen. People more and more are making the connection between our food supply, our health, our safety, but certainly as well for our sort of the political stability. Political leaders are paying particular attention now like never before to food. And for all the right reasons. We're expecting to have 9 billion people on the planet by the year 2050. And the projections of most agronomists are that we're going to have a difficult time at best feeding all of those people. And then there's the last part of our concern, which is really where I want to focus most of my comments. And it's on this idea that I call food citizenship. That it's not enough to be a good food consumer. It's not enough to be diligent about where you're buying your food or have a well-educated palate. It's that policy arena. It's all those problems that I've identified, both the challenges and the opportunities, and how we can try to remedy some of those problems through a better use of public policy. And this is where I want to talk about this idea of food citizenship. People are really interested in making changes in our food system. They actually really care. Some recent polls support this contention. The Kellogg Foundation recently conducted a survey that found that 93% of the people believe it's important that everyone has equal access to fresh fruits and vegetables. 97% of the respondents said they want that healthy food is a very high priority for them. Now that might seem like kind of a duh, but in fact, if I'm saying that healthy food is really important to me, then that sort of raises it up in terms of its scale of impact on me, but also if I'm a political leader or a policymaker, I think that ought to be something within my purview. When it comes to the unhealthy food side and what we know now about obesity and diet-related illnesses, 60% of the population, this is actually from a Pew poll survey, not Kellogg, 60% want government to intervene in the marketplace to reduce childhood obesity. You know, what we hear from the food industry, particularly the purveyors of unhealthy food, is that the government has no business getting involved in regulating us. It has no business in telling us what to eat or not eat. That is really a matter of consumer choice, individual responsibility, and the marketplace will take care of it. Well, we know that's not working. And we know that the public cost of unhealthy diets is rising. But at an individual level, we're seeing that people want government to intervene when it comes to childhood obesity and unhealthy food in general. One of the big controversies right now, interestingly, in the food world is in New York City, where Mayor Bloomberg has, among other very innovative plans, recommended that the size of soda be restricted so that no one can get larger than a 16-ounce cup of soda. Now, you would think from the uproar that has created that you have taken away all individual liberties, and our democracy is now at risk, and that the security of the United States is in fact in jeopardy. I can remember growing up and thinking, wow, a Coke, I can get a 10-ounce, I think it was 10 ounce, was the biggest Coke I could buy. And what a treat that was to have maybe once every other week. Now, of course, we think it's our right to have, be able to drink a gallon of Coca-Cola at a time. Public officials are intervening in the only way they probably know how at this point, which is to try to use some regulatory authority. So all of this, take this all together. Take a look at all of the questions around food security and health and the environment. Look ahead at the future and maybe just say, well, we probably shouldn't be taking food for granted. And I come up with this, I look at that, and it's not just because I've been in this business for a long time. I really believe that food is no longer just a nicety. Food and food policy are now necessities, meaning that we have to pay attention. We have no choice but to pay attention. And we can't take food for granted. We can't ignore the damage that's been done to our bodies and the environment. And we can't ignore the voice of the people who really do want to see change occur. And it's why I believe that cities like Edmonton, provinces like Alberta, countries like Canada and elsewhere are paying particular attention to food plans or food strategies, or in some places they're called food works or other sort of more comprehensive food initiatives, often undertaken by government at a local or provincial or state level, in order to bring about a more systematic focus on food and to begin to promote a healthier food environment, as well as one that's more food secure. We're actually being rational about something. We're actually looking ahead and saying, this is something we need to pay attention to and not wait until there is a food crisis. So New York City has actually several food strategies, but one they call Food Works, which is now, I think, has 57 points in it that are part of the strategy. Everything from how land will be used and incorporated into urban agriculture schemes to making sure that there is adequate access to healthy food through retail outlets, trying to make it easier to start farmers markets, kind of clawing through and pulling away the layers of bureaucracy, of government regulations, sort of all that accumulated stuff, and saying, how can we make government a more active, responsible partner in our food system? How can we put our authorities, our budgets, just the public spotlight on food by using these systems that we already have in place? Because you can go almost anywhere now, or at least not now, but up until recently, and it would be pretty unusual to see a government paying attention to food in a serious way, that food was rarely on the public agenda. I can remember about 10 years ago doing a little work with Seattle and San Diego. And they had just finished their comprehensive plans of development, very large, thick documents about how they wanted the future of their cities and their neighborhoods to look like. And if you did a word search on those very heavy documents, they were so thick, in fact, I think they could stop a bullet at 50 paces, you wouldn't find the word food mentioned. If you put in the word food, it wasn't there. That's not the case anymore. These cities are now making food a deliberate part of their policy work. So London has a food strategy, or Canada, I believe, is working on a food plan or strategy. Sometimes I get the words confused myself. The country of Australia. And as I said, I was just in Korea, and I'm sitting down with about a dozen Koreans, and we're through interpreters and so forth, and with me fumbling with my chopsticks over lunch, trying to maneuver a piece of kimchi into my mouth. I say, well, maybe you should have a food strategy. Well, somebody pipes up and says, well, the mayor of Seoul is going to, on October 13th, will announce a food strategy. And I said, wow, so really, you're going to do that here? Yes, and he has big commitment to urban gardens, a big commitment to high quality, healthy food in the schools, free lunch for everybody in Korea. Every student in their schools gets a free lunch, and they're trying to make it better and better all the time. So this kind of food strategy, food planning, and so forth that's going on, to me, represents a kind of communal responsibility taking on the part of both the public sector and the private sector for food, that they recognize that they have a stake in their food system, and that we all have to work on that. And to me, it brings to mind the words of the Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen, who said that after concluding after years and years of study of global development, of poverty, of famine, of political economies, found that in no nation that he studied throughout history where there was a relatively sound democracy, where information was being shared, where there was transparency, was there ever a famine, even in poor countries. So the poverty itself was not necessarily a determinant of food insecurity or food or possibly famine. It was in fact the lack of a functioning democracy, a free press, and citizen engagement. And I take that, kind of fast forward into the 21st century, into a developed country like Canada or the United States, and say, I want more food democracy. I think that that is going to be the solution toward ensuring a long-term food security and a healthy diet for everybody. And I think one of the ways that I see that we can try to achieve those goals, that we can make food democracy a reality, is through through food policy councils, through organized efforts, coordinated efforts by citizens, by the public sector, NGOs, and the private for-profit sector as well, to come together around a common table and to be more deliberate and thoughtful about food. That is why I've been working on this. I developed a policy council in Hartford, Connecticut in the early 1990s. And I will absolutely confess and own up to the fact that I got the idea from Toronto. I consider one of my good friends and mentors, Rod McRae, who was the head of the Food Policy Council in Toronto at the time, a really vital person in my development and understanding the role of policy and its relationship to food and health. And from that engagement, I feel that I was inspired to do the work that I did in Connecticut. Later, I started the State of Connecticut Food Policy Council, which became the very first state food policy council in the country. So what do we know about food policy councils at this point? Well, they seem to be becoming popular. They seem to be becoming a big deal, just like food. I had been, up until recently, I had been working for an organization in the States called the Community Food Security Coalition, and we finished a census of food policy councils just this spring. In the year 2010, when we last did this census, we had 111 food policy councils in North America, Canada and the US. Today, we have 193. Pretty significant growth in only 2 years. Now, I feel that because of our inadequacies and our sort of census procedures, we did not get as good a sampling of Canada as we would have liked. I think we overlooked a number. But I have found through my travels in Canada and discussions with Canadian colleagues that these many food policy councils or entities like that, networks, coalitions, organized efforts to address food, that they're cropping up all over, that they're becoming more important. And they really are they're emerging very rapidly. Out of these food policy councils, about 134 were local. That's city or county or some combination thereof. About 25 were considered regional, meaning multi-county, some sub-sector area within a state. And then 29 were state or provincial. And I think you may only have 1 or 2 provincial food policy councils in Canada, but I'll have to check. And we had 5 tribal food policy councils in the United States. About 25% of those are actually a part of government. They're sort of formally established either within government or they have a very strong governmental connection. The rest, about 75%, we call them independent. Independent means that they're not formally established under government, but they nevertheless have a very close connection to government. They recognize that if I'm going to be an effective policy body, I have to work with government. I have to find a way to establish that kind of partnership. They are about influencing public policy when it comes to food. They are about coordinating the work of food system stakeholders. They are, in fact, a food system planning venue. It's great to hear you actually have some food people who in your planning department here who are dedicated to food. That's wonderful. That's a very new innovation in the planning world, and I'm glad to see it's taking root here in Edmonton. Food policy councils focus on a full range of food system issues. They're not just about health, they're not just about local food, promoting better access to local food. They're not just about hunger or food insecurity. They embrace really the entire palette, you might say, of the food system canvas. They look at regulations within government and budgets, legislation, existing programs and administrative procedures, and try to figure out how they can be better utilized to promote a certain kind of vision of a food system. And in fact, they are responsible either for developing visions of a food system or perhaps implementing existing ones. They do sometimes conduct, in fact, it's recommended, that they conduct food assessments, that they actually be the entity that knows what is going on in your food system. Get the numbers, get the data, do some research, at least stay on top of the research that's coming out, and use your own native knowledge to find out what is going on in your food system and bring that into the table for discussion. Food policy councils also conduct public education. They are there to talk about the food system, to make it a big deal, even a bigger deal, and to get out there and just put it in the public eye. Use media, use public hearings, use focus groups, use any means at your disposal to make food a part of your everyday story and to make it part of the public agenda. They help to develop priorities for the city and provide advice. They make recommendations. They basically inform the policymakers about what is needed, what is going on now, and they do advocate for changes in the food system. They're not just these sort of wonky policy sorts of shops or institutions. They're really very personal in a way. It's very much about getting to know other people in the food system. Sometimes people that you might otherwise suspect a little bit of not sharing your values. Kind of reaching across these value divides, which food does open up. And seeing how if in fact you can find some common ground. So it is very much of a relationship building exercise. I'd like to recommend to you, if you want to learn more about food policy councils, that we have some resources available online. We have also updated our food policy council directory as a result of the census at foodpolicycouncil.net or at my own website, which is markwinne.com, markwinne.com. You'll find this directory of about 200 or so food policy councils. You'll find a brand new manual on how to start a food policy council called Getting Food Policy Councils Right, written by me and colleague Michael Bergen. And I had a very fortunate partnership over the last year forged with Harvard Law School, which has opened up their own food policy law clinic. This is one of the more exciting innovations as far as I'm concerned, that an institution like Harvard Law would say food is important. And that they now have, in fact, it's perhaps one of the fastest growing aspects of the law school is food law. And students actually now work in communities and with communities around the country, in the US, to try to solve food regulatory issues, look at ordinances and statutes that will affect the food system, and very exciting and very dynamic process. So that they have, with my participation and the Community Food Security Coalition's participating, we have a toolkit. It's called Good Food, Good Law, and it basically looks at all the permutations at a local level on food, and there'll be a statewide version of that soon as well. Just a few quick examples of what food policy councils have been doing. Unfortunately don't have ready examples from Canada at this point. All of them are from the United States. But in Cleveland, Ohio, perhaps one of the more interesting places I've visited, their food policy council has really developed a pretty comprehensive strategy around food. They have changed their zoning laws to favor community gardens and urban farming. They actually have a definition of urban farming now, so that vacant land can be really put into intensive food production. They then looked at economic development resources and realized they had some money and they could commit some of it to food enterprises. So really small grants, Literally, in some cases, seed grants are now available for people who want to start Cleveland-based food enterprises. They have they went to the other end of they also passed some regulations that allow for the backyard raising of chickens and bees. They've called that the Chicks and Bees Ordinance, and now people can have 4 chickens and 1 beehive in their backyard in Cleveland. Created quite a buzz. I know, you were expecting that, I know. I didn't want to disappoint you. But they also went to the other end of the spectrum, and they said, well, we're spending millions of dollars every year buying food for the city, for our schools, for our hospitals, our prisons, and so forth. Why can't we dedicate a percentage of that to locally produced food? Let's stimulate the food economy with our public dollars. That's just, as far as I'm concerned, that's another duh. Well, they've made a commitment, and they give preferential treatment to producers of local food when using public dollars to buy them. In Boulder, Colorado, they have come up with some really innovative planning procedures to try to use public land for sustainable use, for sustainable food production. In my former city of Hartford, Connecticut, we looked at public bus routes and found that they did not connect people in lower income neighborhoods to retail food stores. There's no connect at all. If you didn't own a car, you had no way of getting to a food store. So we were able to make changes in the bus routes. In Missoula, Montana, the Food Policy Council there actually sits on the county's land use board and makes decisions about which land will be developed for housing and which will not, with the intent of holding aside or protecting or conserving as much good farmland as possible. In Kansas City, they've revamped their all their zoning around urban agriculture to make it much easier, like Cleveland, to produce food in the city. In my state of New Mexico, we're working on procurement legislation so that we can direct more of our public dollars to the purchase of locally produced food, and we've set aside funding for school food with the intent of using money to increase the purchase of locally produced food for our schools. And in my former state of Connecticut, our Food Policy Council took the lead in turning around the loss of farmland in that state. We were losing more farmland as a percentage of our remaining land than any other state in the country. It took a 6-year public education effort undertaken by the Food Policy Council in partnership with a very large coalition that we took the lead in putting together. It actually became a 150-member organization coalition called the Working Lands Alliance that brought about a wonderful piece of legislation called the Community Investment Act, which is there to promote a number of things, including the preservation of farmland and a variety of farm enhancement programs and investment programs. So I want to close off here and say that I think that the good news is that we are paying attention to our food system, and we're beginning to develop some really sound policies. So that food, again, is no longer a nicety. It has become a necessity, and our policies recognize that. We also need to know, I think you need to know, that we have to be more intentional to promote and practice food democracy. And that means that we have to reach out to citizens. We have to find ways to be inclusive with all kinds of stakeholders. And oftentimes that means people who we may not be naturally comfortable with. And I can tell you some stories about how it can be naturally uncomfortable with some people. But still, we're trying to work with them. And I think this implies 2 things: that we have to take responsibility, all of us in this room and out there in the greater community, for our food system. And that's the public sector, that's the private sector, and that's individuals. And that we all, if we're going to do that, and if we're going to do it in the public arena, we have to play by the rules. And by that I mean, for instance, money, power, and influence do not give you the right to end run the rules, or avoid transparency, or ignore other interests. And I've seen this happen too often in the United States. So if you're going to play by the rules, everybody has to play by the rules. Food policy councils are a part of the practice of food democracy. And like any other practice, we need to invest our time and our resources in their development and in the leadership of those food policy councils and in their operations. We can't say that we're going to solve all these problems by shipping them off to the food policy council, say, hey, take care of this for us. You know, like any other function of government here, go take care of this. No, it's not that easy. We're learning how food systems work. We're learning how to apply food democracy in the kind of community and public arena. And in order to learn, we need to practice, we need to gather data, and we need to invest in developing people's skills to be able to manage their food system. So I would recommend that we need as much patience as possible, persistence, and some nurturing guidance from others. Let's make sure that we are working to get each of us, say as a food policy council member, a practical level, to be involved in some professional development and skill development. Let's make sure that we're getting as much of good practices as possible. Let's make sure that we all understand how government really functions. So it's that kind of long-term commitment that I think we need. You know, it's just like a garden, right? It's just like a garden. You got to invest in it. You got to keep putting back that compost and other things into the soil. It takes time to build up that garden. And when you do it, if you do it right, it yields some really good results. I think that's the story with the food system. I think that's the story when it comes to food policy and food policy councils. So thank you very much.